Everyone remembers Arnold Schwarzenegger as the man who won everything, 7 Mr. Olympia titles, a career in Hollywood, and eventually the governor's mansion. One name recurs throughout the story: he never fully controlled. A man who beat him when few thought it possible, lost to him when it mattered most, and became one of his closest friends in the sport. That man is Frank Zane. Frank Zane's story is often framed around losing to Arnold, but that framing misses most of it. To understand what that loss meant to Zane, it helps to start earlier, with a teenager in coal country who became one of the most influential physiques in the history of the sport. Zane did not come up through the gyms of California. He trained in Pennsylvania in coal country gymnasiums with equipment that was, by his own account, improvised and homemade. There was no glamour to the setup, just a teenager who had found something he was committed to and kept showing up for. By his late teens, he had placed third in the teenage Mr. America competition, an early indication that his approach was working before the wider bodybuilding world had taken notice. What distinguished Zane from most competitors chasing a Mr. America or Mr. Universe title in that era was not raw genetics. He did not have the frame that produces effortless size. Instead, he brought an exacting attention to detail and treated his physique as a long-term project rather than a short-term goal. That approach defined his career, and it is why his methods are still studied more than 50 years later. The moment that shaped their relationship came in 1968. That year, a 21-year-old Austrian bodybuilder arrived in Miami with a reputation that preceded him. He had already won a Mr. Universe title in Europe and was confident America would respond the same way. It did not. Frank Zane, a schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who had won Mr. America the week before, stepped on stage sharp, lean, and controlled. Arnold, by contrast, appeared soft, still eating rich food, carrying extra size without the definition to match it. Zane later described him as big and pale, with little muscular quality, mass without shape. The judges agreed, and Zane won. For Arnold, the loss was more than embarrassing. He was 21 years old and had crossed an ocean on the conviction that his physique was simply better than anyone else's. He had no contingency for being wrong. When the judges in Miami chose a smaller, sharper, more controlled physique over his, the effect went beyond his competitive record. It reached his sense of who he was. He's since admitted that the defeat sent him into a spiral, a night of telling himself he was a failure, that his sponsor would drop him, that he'd be shipped back to Austria in disgrace. He cried, then slept it off. When he woke up, something in him had recalibrated. He realized the American judges wanted something different than the European style he'd been trained in. More polish, more proportion, less brute size. It was, by his own account, the first time he understood that being the biggest man in the room wasn't automatically the same thing as being the best. Arnold's first move after that defeat wasn't to avoid Frank Zane. He invited him to move to California and train together. Most people, stung by a public defeat, would put distance between themselves and the person who beat them. Arnold did the opposite. He wanted Zane close, and he wanted to learn from him. The two men ended up sharing gym space, sharing meals, and according to both of them, sharing a shameless sweet tooth. Late at night before major contests, the two rivals would sneak out to a local pie shop and split an entire cherry pie between them, calorie counts aside. It never seemed to hurt either of their physiques. The next day, they'd both go on to win their respective titles. This detail reflects the kind of rivalry it was. It wasn't bitter, and it wasn't built on hatred. It was built on mutual respect between two men who wanted more than anything to be the best version of themselves and who happened to keep ending up on the same stage. It also reflects an aspect of Arnold that is often underestimated. It would have been easy for him to treat Zane as a threat to be avoided, someone whose success only highlighted his own failure. Instead, he treated him as a resource. He recognized that Zane had something worth learning, a level of precision and control that Arnold's own size-first approach hadn't accounted for. And he was confident enough, even fresh off a public defeat, to bring that person into his inner circle rather than push him away. That kind of decision reflects a genuine hunger to actually be the best, not just to look like it. For Zane's part, training alongside the man who would go on to dominate the sport for the next decade gave him a front row seat to exactly what he was up against. He watched up close as Arnold transformed from the soft, unprepared competitor he'd beaten in Miami into the far more polished physique that would go on to win Mr. Olympia titles year after year. This proximity may have pushed Zane to refine his own approach even further. Watching his training partner solve the size and polish equation pushed him to double down on the one thing that still separated the two of them: proportion. But respect didn't erase competition. For the next several years, the story flipped entirely. By the mid-1970s, Arnold Schwarzenegger wasn't just winning, he was dominating. Frank Zane, despite years of refining his physique into one of the most aesthetically celebrated bodies in the sport's history, kept finishing behind him. In 1974, it was Franco Columbu who got past him. In 1975, it was Arnold. Year after year, Zane stood on Olympia stages built from smaller, tighter, more symmetrical muscle than almost anyone else in the field, and year after year, someone else's name got called first. This is the part of the story that rarely appears in highlight reels. Not the wins, but the years of coming close and walking away with nothing. Zane did not change his approach to compete on size the way many of his rivals did. Instead, he leaned into patience. Years later, reflecting on that stretch of near misses, he offered the philosophy that got him through it. Stay in the game long enough, stay persistent enough, and the competition ahead of you will eventually move on. Don't chase the men in front of you, outlast them. It was a simple idea, and it worked. Patience alone doesn't win Mr. Olympia titles. While Zane was waiting out the competition ahead of him, he was also refining an approach to training that looked almost nothing like what his rivals were doing. Other top competitors of that era were chasing size in the most straightforward way possible. Heavier weights, bigger meals, more mass. Zane went in the opposite direction. He became known in bodybuilding circles by the nickname the Chemist, a reflection of how methodically he approached his diet and training, adjusting factors like carbohydrate and sodium intake day by day in the lead-up to a contest to arrive on stage in exactly the condition he wanted. His training philosophy centered on the idea that form matters more than weight on the bar. Rather than measuring progress purely in added plates, Zane prioritized precise movement, controlled tempo, and what bodybuilders now call the mind-muscle connection, actively feeling a muscle work rather than simply moving a weight from point A to point B. He relied heavily on visualization and meditation as part of his training process, treating the mental side of the sport as seriously as the physical side. He trained with his mind first, he later explained, and let the body follow. The result of that precision was a physique built around proportion rather than raw mass. Broad shoulders, a dramatically small waist, and a V-taper that became his signature. Where his competitors were adding size wherever they could, Zane was sculpting balance, treating his body less like a mass to be built and more like a composition to be arranged. It is a philosophy that sounds almost artistic for a sport built on iron and repetition, and it is a large part of why his physique is still held up today as one of the most complete the sport has produced. The Wettmatrix did not just help him outlast the competition, it is what finally let him overtake it. In 1977, with Arnold retired from competition and pursuing a career in film, Frank Zane stepped into the spotlight that had been just out of reach for years. He won the Mr. Olympia, then he won it again in 1978. Then again in 1979, 3 consecutive titles, all won at a body weight that would be considered small by today's standards, sometimes under 200 pounds. In an era that was already starting to reward size over shape, Zane showed that precision, symmetry, and control could still beat raw mass. His waist measured around 29 inches. His physique became a template that bodybuilders still study today, decades later, as the standard for proportion. For 3 years, Frank Zane was no longer the man who lost to Arnold. He was simply the champion. Then in 1980, Arnold came back. Zane walked into the 1980 Mr. Olympia as the defending 3-time champion. What he didn't know, what almost none of the competitors knew, was that Arnold Schwarzenegger had quietly decided to return to competition that same year. It was a surprise entry. Arnold won, Zane placed lower. The result became one of the most controversial outcomes in the sport's history, with fans and fellow competitors questioning whether the judging had been fair or whether the outcome had been decided before anyone even stepped on stage. Zane was the reigning 3-time champion, having spent years building toward that exact moment, refining a physique that had finally put his name at the top of the sport after a decade of near misses. Then, without warning, the man who had started the rivalry 12 years earlier returned, not as a rookie, but as a 7-time champion with nothing left to prove and everything to gain from another headline-grabbing win. Other competitors that year said they felt blindsided. Some suggested the outcome had been influenced before a single pose was struck. Whether or not that's true, the optics were enough that the 1980 Mr. Olympia remains one of the most argued over results in the sport's history. Decades later, when Zane was asked directly whether he thought Arnold deserved that win, he didn't dodge the question, and he didn't take the easy shot either. He said plainly that Arnold wasn't in his best shape that night, that he'd seen him look better before, but he added that he himself wasn't at his best either. No excuses, no bitterness. An honest assessment, decades removed from the sting of it. It would have been easy for Zane to take the opposite approach. He had a legitimate grievance and could have spent the rest of his life pointing at 1980 as the year the sport was taken from him. Instead, his answer split the difference, crediting neither man with a peak performance and moving on without turning it into a lasting grudge. It reflected the same restraint that carried him through the losing years, measured, unemotional, focused on the work rather than the outcome. That restraint says a lot about who Frank Zane is. He had reason to still be angry about 1980. Instead, his response was measured, almost clinical. The same discipline that built his physique applied to how he discusses the moment that arguably cost him a 4th title. Zane's reflections aren't uniformly generous, however. In a recent docuseries revisiting Arnold's career, an 81-year-old Zane described the young Arnold he first met in 1968, a competitor who carried himself with total confidence despite, in Zane's words, not yet being in the shape to justify it. He described Arnold at that time as arrogant and cocky, acting like a winner before he'd proven anything, focused entirely on being big rather than being refined. It's a candid, unfiltered assessment from a man in his 80s looking back more than 50 years at a rivalry that shaped both of their careers. But it wasn't delivered with resentment. It was delivered with the clarity of someone describing a much younger version of a man he would go on to train with, compete against, and ultimately respect for the rest of his life. Arrogant, yes, but also eventually willing to listen, willing to change, and willing to invite the man who beat him into his own gym. Zane continued competing into the early 1980s, stepping away from the Olympia stage after 1983 and closing out a competitive career that spanned more than 20 years, and by some counts over 150 awards. Retirement from competition did not mean retirement from the sport. In 1985, Frank and his wife Christine opened a training facility called Zane Haven in Palm Springs, California, where they worked one-on-one with clients pursuing the same symmetrical, proportionate physique that had made Zane's career. It was not a gym in the mass market sense, but a specialized studio built around the same principles of form, patience, and proportion that had defined his own approach to the sport. That philosophy remained consistent with age. Decades after his last Olympia win, Zane was still training, still posting updates on his physique, and still coaching clients privately well into his 80s. Evidence that the approach he built his career on was not simply a strategy for winning trophies, but a sustainable way to stay in shape over a lifetime. In 1994, he was inducted into the Joe Weider Bodybuilding Hall of Fame, recognizing his influence on the sport. In 2003, Zane received the Arnold Schwarzenegger Lifetime Achievement Award, an acknowledgement from the man who once lost to him and later trained beside him, of his lasting contribution to the sport. Frank Zane is one of only 3 men who ever beat Arnold Schwarzenegger in a bodybuilding competition. Not 2, not 5, 3, across the whole of Arnold's career. He shares that distinction with Sergio Oliva and Chester Yorton. Zane won 3 Mr. Olympia titles of his own, competing for decades at the highest level of a sport that by the 1980s had begun moving in a direction his physique was not built for. He did not win by matching size with size. He won by demonstrating that shape, proportion, and discipline could hold their own against pure mass. And when he lost, which happened more than is often remembered, he did not reinvent himself to chase the trend. He waited, stayed sharp, and let the competition move ahead of him, exactly as he said he would. There's a reason his physique still gets cited as a reference point decades after he last competed. Bodybuilding as a sport has largely moved in the opposite direction since Zane's era, chasing size at a scale that would have been unrecognizable in the 1970s. Yet when people discuss the single best-looking physique the sport has produced, Zane's name still comes up constantly, often ahead of competitors who outweighed him by 50 or 60 pounds. That is not nostalgia. It is a genuine, ongoing acknowledgement that what he built was closer to correct than what came after it. Coaches still reference his approach to teach the mind-muscle connection. Competitors in the modern classic physique division, a category built specifically to reward proportion over pure mass, are essentially competing in a format Zane's career predicted decades in advance. It is also worth remembering how unlikely all of this was. A school teacher from coal country, training with improvised equipment, went up against a physical specimen who would go on to become one of the most famous human beings on the planet. He beat him, then lost to him, then trained alongside him, then outlasted him, then was handed an award bearing his rival's own name. Written as fiction, it would feel too tidy, but it happened exactly that way, and every part of it is on the record. That is the story behind the headline. Not a bitter old rivalry finally being settled, but a decades-long relationship between 2 men who pushed each other, beat each other, trained together, and ended up on the same side of history, even if only one of them became a household name. Frank Zane never needed to be the biggest man in the room. He just needed to outlast everyone who was.